It was a crisp morning on election day, and across the country, citizens were lining up to cast their votes in what was promised to be a historic presidential race. But in one small town, a group of black voters arrived at their designated polling station only to find the doors locked and a heavy police presence waiting for them. Confusion quickly turned to frustration as officials claimed that they were not on the voter roll, despite many holding registration cards in hand. These were people who had exercised their right to vote for years, yet now they were being turned away without explanation. Among the crowd was Marcus, a retired school teacher who had spent his life inspiring young minds about the importance of democracy. For him, voting wasn't just a right, it was a responsibility. But as he stood there, trying to reason with an unyielding officer, the weight of the situation began to sink in. It wasn't just a bureaucratic mix-up. Something much larger and more sinister seemed to be at play. The tension in the air was palpable, and as news of similar incidents began to surface from other areas, the group realized they weren't alone. Phones were pulled out to document the unfolding chaos, capturing the tears, anger, and disbelief. But what none of them knew was that their determination to uncover the truth would set off a chain reaction far beyond their small town. As the hours ticked by and the nation watched in stunned silence, Marcus and his fellow voters began piecing together a story that no one was ready to hear. What they discovered wasn't just shocking. It had the power to reshape the country's understanding of fairness and equality. What exactly was happening? And why were they being silenced? Stay tuned. As the afternoon stretched on, Marcus and the others refused to leave the polling station. They huddled together, sharing their stories and frustrations. It turned out that most of them had received confirmation letters weeks ago, ensuring their voter registration was valid. Others had even voted at the very same location in previous elections. Yet today, it was as if their names had been wiped clean from the system. The officers stationed at the polling sites stood firm, offering little explanation and even less sympathy. The crowd began to grow as more residents arrived, only to face the same roadblocks. Among them was Angela, a local activist who immediately sensed something was deeply wrong. Angela had spent years advocating for voter rights, and she knew all too well that disenfranchisement often targeted marginalized communities. She encouraged the group to call their local election board, but every attempt led to long hold times or vague answers that provided no clarity. Angela decided to record interviews with the voters, asking them to share their experiences and any evidence they had of their eligibility. She knew these stories had to be documented. Something bigger than their small town was unraveling. Meanwhile, rumors began to swirl. Some whispered about technical glitches in the voting system, while others suspected deliberate interference. The tension among the group shifted to a mix of fear and anger, and questions loomed larger with every passing hour. Why was this happening now, in one of the most critical elections of their lifetime? And who was responsible? What Marcus and the others didn't yet realize was that their persistence and refusal to stay silent were about to unearth a series of events far more calculated than anyone could imagine. Something was being hidden, but how far did it go? The answers would soon stun the nation. As the crowd outside the polling station swelled, emotions began to boil over. People were no longer simply frustrated, they felt betrayed. Among the growing group was Mr. Harris, a retired school teacher who had lived in the community for decades. He shared his story of proudly voting in every election since the 1960s, often recalling the struggles and sacrifices made during the civil rights movement. For him, this moment felt like history repeating itself. His voice quivered as he spoke, a mixture of disbelief and determination. His presence added a deeper weight to the gathering, as younger voters began to see the issue through his eyes. A stark reminder of how far the fight for equality still had to go. Angela, sensing the urgency of the situation, made a bold decision. She live-streamed the scene on social media, narrating the stories of those denied their right to vote. Within minutes, the video began to gain traction. Comments and messages of support poured in, with viewers demanding answers and sharing their own accounts of similar incidents in other areas. Angela's phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, but one message stood out. It was from a journalist at a national news outlet, asking for an interview. This wasn't just a local issue anymore, it was becoming a national conversation. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random glitch. He remembered overhearing a conversation at his part-time job about certain measures being taken to secure the election. At the time, it hadn't meant much to him, but now it gnawed at his mind. Could this be part of a larger plan? And if so, who was behind it? As night fell, the group decided to stay, refusing to back down. The air was thick with tension and unanswered questions. What they didn't realize was that their defiance was setting the stage for a revelation that would ripple far beyond their small community. As the hours passed, the crowd outside the polling station grew restless. More people from neighboring communities arrived after seeing Angela's live stream. Some brought food and water, while others came with signs and chants, determined to make their voices heard. The tension between the protesters and the authorities stationed at the scene became palpable. Officers stood in a line, their expressions unreadable, as if waiting for instructions on how to handle the escalating situation. Every once in a while, whispers between them suggested they were just as unsure about the unfolding events. Angela's video had now reached millions. News crews began arriving, their cameras capturing the raw emotions of the crowd. Journalists approached individuals for interviews, highlighting their personal stories of being denied access to vote. The weight of those testimonies began to reveal a pattern. Most of those affected were from underrepresented communities. Angela couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this was more than negligence. It felt intentional, but proving it seemed nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Marcus decided to investigate further. Armed with nothing but his phone and a growing suspicion, he scoured the internet and began connecting dots. He found records of polling stations across the state suddenly closing in areas with large Black and minority populations, all citing vague reasons like technical malfunctions or staff shortages. He pieced together reports of similar issues cropping up in key districts nationwide. It was no coincidence. Inside the station, tension was boiling over. Workers whispered in hushed tones, nervously avoiding eye contact with the protesters outside. One employee, a young woman named Danielle, seemed especially distraught. She glanced at the stack of ballots she'd been told to set aside for review, and her conscience gnawed at her. But the instructions had been firm, strictly from the top. What was she supposed to do? Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder, their determination shaking the walls. Something had to give. Just as Danielle wrestled with her moral dilemma, a sudden commotion broke out at the polling station. A man in a sharp suit, flanked by two others who looked equally authoritative, marched in with an air of confidence. He introduced himself as a representative from the state election board. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. The workers, who had been quietly going about their tasks, froze, exchanging nervous glances. Angela, still outside but aware of the activity within, sensed that something big was happening. The man's voice carried over the murmurs of the staff. He spoke firmly, announcing that the delays and set-aside ballots were part of a standard audit process, necessary to ensure fairness. But Danielle's face betrayed her disbelief. She knew this wasn't true. Something about his explanation felt rehearsed, calculated, and deliberately vague. As he walked through the room, his eyes scanned the workers, daring anyone to question his authority. Meanwhile, outside, Marcus was approached by a whistleblower who had seen Angela's stream. The man handed Marcus a flash drive, whispering hurriedly about leaked communications and urging him to share it with the world. Marcus immediately pulled out his laptop and began reviewing the files. What he found was shocking: emails and memos revealing a coordinated effort to suppress votes in key districts. The instructions came from individuals in high-ranking positions, detailing how to create delays, shut down machines, and reject ballots under flimsy pretenses. It was no longer a suspicion, it was a conspiracy. As Marcus worked to verify the information, Angela's live stream caught a confrontation unfolding at the polling station entrance. Protesters had stopped the suited man as he tried to leave. The crowd demanded answers, shouting questions that he sidestepped with measured responses. But his composed facade began to crack when someone produced a megaphone and read aloud excerpts from the leaked emails. The mood turned electric. People realized the fight wasn't just about one polling station. It was about the integrity of the entire election. As the crowd grew louder, the suited man's composure completely shattered. He attempted to push his way through, but the protesters stood firm. Danielle, now emboldened by the revelations and the energy of the crowd, stepped forward and confronted him. "You owe us the truth," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her words hung in the air, silencing the crowd for a moment. The man looked at her, his jaw tightening, and for a second, it seemed he might actually respond. But instead, he tried to brush her off, muttering something about misinformation. Then, Marcus arrived with Angela, holding up his laptop. "This isn't misinformation," Marcus declared. "It's your emails, your plans to undermine democracy, exposed for everyone to see." He handed the laptop to Danielle, who quickly shared it with the protesters. The documents were damning: names, dates, and step-by-step instructions on how to suppress specific voter groups. The crowd erupted, their chants of justice reverberating through the night. Just when it seemed the tide had fully turned, sirens blared in the distance. A fleet of unmarked cars pulled up, and a team of federal investigators stepped out. One agent approached the suited man and placed him under arrest, citing charges of voter suppression and election interference. The crowd cheered, but Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. She watched as the agent whispered something to the man, who smirked despite his handcuffs. Later that evening, as Marcus uploaded the leaked documents for the world to see, Angela received an anonymous message. It was a simple warning: "This goes deeper than you think." Attached was a file that hinted at a much larger network of individuals involved, not just at the state level but nationally. The realization hit them all at once. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of uncovering a far-reaching conspiracy, one that would shake the very foundation of democracy if fully exposed. As the dust settled and the crowd began to disperse, Danielle stood quietly, watching the suited man being taken away. There was a sense of relief in the air, but it was mixed with unease. The documents Marcus had uploaded were spreading rapidly online, with people across the nation now demanding answers. It felt like a victory, but also like the opening of a much larger battle. Danielle turned to Marcus and Angela, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. In the following days, the media exploded with coverage of the scandal. Investigations expanded, uncovering more players in the scheme. The story of the brave group that exposed the corruption gained national attention. Danielle's emotional speech at a local rally went viral, inspiring thousands to join in demanding transparency and accountability. For the first time, she felt the weight of what they had accomplished, not just for themselves, but for communities everywhere who had faced similar injustices. Still, there were lingering questions. Who had sent the anonymous message to Angela? How deep did the corruption go? And could they truly trust the systems in place to fix what had been broken? These questions would remain unanswered for now, but one thing was clear: the power of ordinary people to stand up against injustice was undeniable. Danielle, Marcus, and Angela returned to their lives, though nothing would ever be the same. They had become symbols of resilience and courage, a reminder that change often starts with those who refuse to stay silent. As the nation moved forward, their story became a testament to the importance of vigilance and the strength found in unity. And while their fight had ended, the echoes of their actions would continue to inspire others to rise and demand a better future.